Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back for the final session of the two-day Dilli series CEPA webinar on the geopolitical impact of CEPA. In such times, when CEPA turns out to be more of a necessity than just an asset, it seems apt that we conclude this year's webinar with a panel discussion on the topic Key Enablers for India as a Regional Maritime Power to Ensure Stability, Security, Peaceful Coexistence, and Development in the Indian Ocean region. Moderating a power-packed panel comprising luminaries such as Vice Admiral G. Ashok Kumar, Rear Admiral S. Y. Shrikhande, Professor Shrikant Kondapalli, and Dr. Darshana Barua is no mean feat. Thus, we need a moderator par excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to invite Admiral Arun Prakash, Param Vishes Seva Medal, Ati Vishes Seva Medal, Veer Chakra, Vishes Seva Medal, and former Chief of Naval Staff to chair and moderate the panel discussion. At the zenith of his distinguished naval career, Admiral Arun Prakash served as the India's 18th Chief of Naval Staff and the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. A naval aviator by specialization, he commanded a carrier-borne fighter squadron, a naval air station, and 4 naval warships, including the carrier INS Virat. He has logged over 2,500 hours on fighters, patrol aircrafts, and helicopters. On elevation to flag rank, he commanded the Eastern Fleet, the National Defense Academy, and the Western Naval Command. In 2001, he was designated the first Commander-in-Chief of the Andaman and Nicobar Joint Command in Port Blair. He is a graduate of the Indian Air Force Test Pilot School and the Defense Services Staff College and the United States Naval War College. During the 1971 war, he was awarded the Veer Chakra for gallantry while flying with an Indian Air Force fighter bomber squadron. In staff appointments, he headed a Navy's aviation personnel branches and served as the Vice Chief of Naval Staff. His notable contributions as the Chief of Naval Staff include formulation of doctrines and strategies, the development of foreign maritime cooperation, and promotion of indigenization. Post-retirement, he served 2 terms as a National Security Advisory Board member and was the chairman of the National Maritime Foundation. He writes and speaks on strategic and defense-related topics and has published a compendium of speeches and writings titled From the Crow's Nest. May I now invite Admiral Arun Prakash to initiate the proceedings for the panel discussion. The virtual floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Cadet Gayat, for that introduction. Can I be seen and heard adequately?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear, sir.
Thank you. Commandant INA, Vice Admiral Puneet Bahal, Deputy Commandant, Principal, members of the Academy, staff, midshipmen, and cadets. I know you had a very interesting session this morning, but I hope that you all had a light lunch so that everyone can stay awake this afternoon. I am pleased to welcome participants of the Dilli Seminar 2022 to this concluding event, which will see presentations by 4 panelists chosen as much for their eminence as for their domain expertise. Now, young ladies and gentlemen, please consider the possibility that as future leaders of our Navy, you may find yourselves in the position of a first responder in a fast developing situation at sea. It may be a maritime interception, disaster relief, or a diplomatic incident. Directives and rules of engagement will not always cover all eventualities, and it could be your initiative and judgment that decides the course of events. Therefore, it is important that your fundamentals are sound and your perspectives are based on a clear understanding about concepts of sea power, preferably before you leave the academy. Over the past 2 days, you've heard speakers dissect this topic into sub-themes and discuss them at length. This has hopefully set the stage for this expert panel to discuss the topic of key enablers for India as a regional maritime power to ensure stability, security, peaceful coexistence, and development in the IOR. Now, admittedly, you'll agree this theme is not only a mouthful, but is also aspirational in tenor and expansive in scope. But it does have the potential to generate an interesting discussion. And I say this because for India to become the guarantor of all that is promised in this theme presumes a degree of eminence in economic status, geopolitical heft, and maritime power. The question is, does India wield this kind of power at this juncture? That's something that you have to think about. As naval officers, you must always remember that the uniqueness of sea power lies in its versatility. Unlike land power and air power, its peacetime roles are equal in importance to those it accomplishes in war. A warship can be positioned anywhere in the world seas, right up to territorial waters, without infringing national sovereignty. And by its mere presence, the warship can attain political ends through messages of friendship, reassurance, intimidation, or coercion. Since navies are used as instruments of state policy, as naval officers, you must also remember one precept of international relations, which is that nations invariably act in accordance with the principle of political realism. They place their self interest uppermost with the goal of ensuring their own security. Let me give you a small example. Way back in 2005, the US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice surprised many of us by offering America's help to make India a great power, as she said. 4 years later, her successor, Hillary Clinton, went a step further and declared in New Delhi that India was not just a regional power, but a global power. And this was in 2009. So, as hard headed and pragmatic military professionals, we knew that great powers are not created with the help of others, but rise on the strength of their own accomplishments. We also knew that in the fullness of time, India will certainly take its place near the top of the world order. So, why was the US offering such blandishments at this point of time? The answer, of course, was self interest. The US has been badly in need of a partner in this region, and India's appeal lies in a number of factors, including its military strength, its growing economy, the size of its market, and its human resources and talent pool. Here, you must note the role played by maritime power in shaping international perceptions, how people look at you. For decades, India had fielded amongst the largest armies and air forces in the world. But this scarcely caused a ripple in the global strategic community. It was only in the 1980s when India significantly enhanced its maritime power and mounted some expeditionary operations that the world sat up and started taking notice. The 2004 Great Asian Tsunami marked another defining moment which established the Indian Navy as a credible maritime power. Other developments that brought India's maritime security into focus included the phenomenon of globalization, the drama of rampant piracy in Somalia, and the November 2008 terror attack on Bombay from the sea. So, before I hand over to our distinguished panelists, let me dwell briefly on three key enablers that, to my mind, can help or hinder India's attainment of regional power status. I will start with what is termed as foreign cooperation in the Navy's parlance. Our smaller neighbors, especially the island states, frequently seek maritime security either through direct naval presence or through requests for material aid, training assistance, and advice. Also of concern to New Delhi have been the economic and security implications of China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative and its maritime component, which cuts a huge swath across the Indo Pacific and Africa. The obvious answer was for India to craft a long term counter strategy based on economics, geopolitics, and hard as well as soft power. But we've not always been able to respond to our neighbors' requests with the desired alacrity due to a lack of internal coordination. Delayed responses on our part have led some of our friends to turn to China for help, which is good neither for them nor for us. This is an issue of vital importance which calls for a whole of government approach in New Delhi. Now, with the new Maritime Security Coordinator in place, it will hopefully be accorded the high priority it deserves. A second area of concern is China's attainment of the self proclaimed status of a maritime great power. I'm sure Professor Kondapalli has spoken about this or will speak about it. Now, this claim is substantiated by the fact that not only does China possess the world's largest navy, by numbers at least, it has also acquired every other component of maritime power. It has the world's largest coast guard and merchant navies, a dynamic shipbuilding industry, modern and efficient ports, and a huge ocean going fishing fleet. So, India's decision makers must be made to realize that a fighting navy such as ours constitutes just one strand of a nation's maritime strength. Only when the other components, which I've just mentioned, are in place will India be able to stake a claim to true maritime power status. This brings me to the last key enabler which I want to talk about, which calls for your close attention, and that is our technological constraints. Having missed the 17th century industrial revolution that transformed Europe, independent India has leapfrogged from the status of an agrarian or agricultural economy to become a service economy. This has left major gaps in industrialization and handicapped our defense industrial base. Consequently, we face an anomalous situation wherein India possesses one of the world's largest armed forces and yet is compelled to support them through massive imports. Despite the Navy's determined push for indigenization, our home built warships and submarines still have significant imported content. This places a constraint not only on the support that our fleets can expect, but also on our endeavors to lend support to our friends and neighbors, a topic which we are going to talk about. Against this backdrop, there are a number of positive markers to guide India's destiny as a benign maritime power, willing and able to contribute to stability, security, and development in our region. The leading mark has been set by Prime Minister Modi's vision of Sagar, which is the acronym for security and growth for all in the region, and has become a watchword for regional maritime cooperation. We also have the Sagarmala initiative, which is an ambitious project for port-led development of the maritime sector. And finally, we have the Prime Minister's exhortation to strive for Atmanirbhar Bharat, or a self-reliant India in the industrial field. The point to note here is that the success of all these initiatives will depend on the energy with which they are pursued and whether or not we can bring a whole of government approach to bear on their implementation. Finally, I'm going to emphasize that a state's long term security policies must be rooted in a vision of its place in the world and a clear enunciation of national aims and objectives. Given our vast maritime domain, wherein reside many vital interests and responsibilities, it is high time for India to conceptualize and promulgate a national strategy for maritime security. Once again, this is an issue that should go on the priority list of our maritime security advisor, whom I will now call upon to take up the microphone. I'm not going to introduce Vice Admiral Ashok Kumar because I know he spoke this morning and he's already been introduced, except to say that the fact that he has been selected by the Government of India as India's first maritime security coordinator speaks volumes about his distinguished career in the Navy, the last few years of which he spent in the posts of Deputy Chief of Naval Staff and Vice Chief of Naval Staff. So over to you, Ashok. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. Admiral Arun Prakash, my co-panelists, Commandant INA, and the cadets. It's a pleasure again for me to be here. I spoke in the forenoon session as well. And this topic, key enablers for India as regional maritime power to ensure stability, security, peaceful coexistence and development in IOR. Now, my mind goes back to three important activities that have happened in the recent past. First of which, like Admiral Arun Prakash mentioned, is articulating the conceptual vision for our nation called Sagar, Security and Growth for All in the Region. This was announced by Prime Minister Modi at Mauritius in 2015. That is the first. And this now, in fact, every activity of our nation when it comes to the region or maritime cooperation in the region is actually driven by this conceptual vision of Sagar. The second I must mention is the United Nations Security Council open debate, which the Prime Minister chaired on the topic of enhancing maritime security, a case for international cooperation. This was in August last year when we were in the presidentship for a month. The third, of course, is the appointment of National Maritime Security Coordinator, who just happens to be the apex level coordination for all the maritime activity kind of which goes on, and just to ensure that one man's policy does not work at cross purposes with some other ministries or departments or agencies in the maritime domain. So these are the three. Now, when it comes to ensuring stability, security, peaceful coexistence and development in the IOR, I see this topic as something which is external to India rather than merely internal. Because the morning topic, when I spoke, I had mentioned this, I was going to concentrate internally, and in the afternoon session externally. For all nations, I mean, if you were to see the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development annual report, 80% of global trade is maritime in nature. So the moment that happens, every nation's prosperity is directly linked to the maritime domain and to maritime security. So this becomes a huge responsibility for everybody. And the IOR especially is a very special place because of the kind of traffic which is there. You all are aware as to how most of the oil, most of the container traffic of the world goes through the IOR region. A lot of major parts in the world, including the growing ones, are actually dependent upon maritime security of slocks which go through the Indian Ocean region. So how do we handle this responsibility of Sagar? I mean, as a nation, not just the Navy. I think there is a heavy lifting which is done by the Navy, which is in addressing transnational security threats, transnational maritime security threats. As I mentioned, almost all non-traditional maritime security threats are transnational in nature, and therefore there is a need for a multinational approach when dealing with those. The first step in that is domain awareness. And for this, of course, there are a lot of it which has happened, which I'll come to. The second point, I think, is sharing of information, which is a must, and identifying and sharing information on vessels of interest, not just white shipping alone, but vessels of interest. White shipping may well be the first step in identifying the vessels of interest. And of course, there needs to be mechanisms put in place to respond, whether it is through SOPs, whether it is through deployments, whether it is to just MOUs, or merely by just understanding. And the other component of development of growth, which is security and growth for all in the region, is, I think, through maritime enhanced connectivity, which I'll briefly touch upon, but I'll mainly concentrate on the maritime forces. Okay, what do we do? Already there is considerable amount of activity that happens in order to ensure security and growth for all in the region. If you were to just look at bilateral engagements, the Navy and the Coast Guards in a number of cases undertakes is that we do exclusive economic zone patrols for a number of countries. This essentially because there are these island nations with huge EEZs, 1,000 times more than their land area, and they don't have the capacity to patrol them. So non-traditional threats like IUU fishing or gun running, drug smuggling through their waters is rampant. And in order to address that, the Indian Navy, and in some cases the Indian Coast Guard as well, does the exclusive economic zone patrols for our friendly neighborhood or countries in the IOR. Second is coordinated patrols. This is along the IMBL, International Maritime Boundary Lines, with countries that we share IMBLs with, whether it is Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, or Indonesia on our east. We, of course, have continuous patrols on the IMBLs with Pakistan and Sri Lanka on the other side. White Shipping Technical Agreement. I mentioned about domain awareness. So the White Shipping Technical Agreement with IFC IOR having come in is something that helps us develop a comprehensive maritime domain awareness picture. And so as to enable these countries to share their white shipping information, India has also been involved in a number of countries in setting up their coastal security radar stations or radar chains and a mechanism by which they can transfer this plot. Data centers, basically. Capacity building, there's huge involvement by India in capacity building, whether it's providing ships or aircraft. The recent one of Dornier being handed over to Sri Lanka, you would have read in the news. And capability enhancements, merely training. There are nearly 1,000 vacancies that Indian Navy offers to our IOR neighbors in various training institutions of our Navy. And unlike the other services, these are not short capsule courses of 1 week and 1 month. These are, about the INA, where we have international students who are there for 4 years doing a BTech. Then, of course, bilateral exercises is one element of that. The other one is hydrographic cooperation. Making of navigational charts is actually done by the Indian Hydrographic Organization. Similarly, the oceanographic cooperation, even for their CLCS claims, not only about the continental shelf, extended continental shelf claims, not only for India, but also for our neighbors, our oceanographers are very involved. Number of infrastructure projects which we put in, both military and in civil, which when I come to connectivity, I'll talk about a little about civil. But as I mentioned in the morning, in all these bilateral and multilateral initiatives, I think the two biggest ones are the mission-based deployment, which has helped enhance our ability to react to any developing situation and undertake foreign cooperation with all the countries in that region. Of course, in order for us to enhance our ability to sustain in the areas of mission-based deployments, we also have reciprocal logistic support agreements. You probably heard of LIMOA, which is the Logistic Exchange Memorandum Agreement with the United States. We have the provisioning of reciprocal logistic support agreement, PRLSA, with France, and we have with a number of other countries, whether it is Australia, whether it is Japan, and a lot of our friends and partners in the maritime domain. Of course, the second initiative is the IFC IOR, where not only is this comprehensive MDA collated, but also shared with our partners. We already have, I think, more than about 25 countries and a number of multilateral organizations like the Crimario down southwest, and in BRMTC in Italy, or to the east at IFC Singapore. So all this enable us to share information as well. Multilateral cooperation, there are a number of them. You all heard of IONS, which was started in 2008. It has now been 14 years since its commission. We have over 24 members of IONS, and I think 8 to 10 observers in IONS. And IONS has got various verticals with which all non-traditional threats are kind of attended to collectively. We also have the IORA, which came into existence in 1997. There are 22 members now, and blue economy cooperation amongst the IORA nations is one big cooperation mechanism that exists. And the other one, of course, is this, that they have a maritime security vertical now, which of course the Indian Navy handles for the IORA. Milan, which was happening in Port Blair, which what started as just the Andaman Sea countries getting together at Port Blair, because the scope and complexity and the numbers increased, it has been shifted to Vizag, and last February we had the first of the Vizag's Milans with 40 different countries participating. We've now become the member at the Combined Maritime Forces at Bahrain, which is a US-led, nearly, I think, 32 members in CMF. However, we have been undertaking POG, or patrolling of the Gulf, fighting the Somali pirates since 2008. World Food Program escorts, which is a part of Op Atlanta, escorting ships through the piracy-infested waters of the coast of Somalia, down south to Somalia, Kenya, or to Tanzania, is something that the Indian Navy quite regularly does. Quad and Malabar, I'm sure in the last session too, people spoke about Quad and the Malabar series of exercise with the 4 countries two together. Now, various other mechanisms, whether it is BIMSTEC, which is the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral partnership, or the Colombo Security Conclave, which is the new block, which is basically Sri Lanka, Maldives, India. It started with Sri Lanka, Maldives, India. Now we also have Bangladesh, Mauritius, and Seychelles. Seychelles is not in a member, but Seychelles is an observer. And each of these two are focused on maritime security. RECAP is an organization which was started to fight piracy, and India is a member of that. We now have more than 20 countries which are members of RECAP, and the RECAP ISC I mentioned about in my last session as well is now actually headed, the ED Executive Director of the Information Sharing Center of RECAP at Singapore. Is actually the ex-DGCG. There are a number of multilateral exercises as well, whether it is RIMPAC, whether it is, I mentioned about Malabar, SIPMEX, which is a new one, which we intend to take it up to India-ASEAN maritime exercise. And so these are Navy to Navy stroke Coast Guard specific initiatives of maritime coordination. But however, connectivity, there are a number of them in the connectivity angle as well. BIMSTEC Port Conclave is one such. The conclave is actually aimed at providing for maritime interaction and port-led development and connectivity between all these countries. The INA, I think, team in the first session yesterday spoke about the Kaladan multimodal project. That's one which is on. The India-Japanese initiative of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which started in November 16, in order to create, good developmental and cooperation projects in Africa, is something which is on. Project MOSM, of course, is basically by the Ministry of Culture, but this seeks to document and kind of take forward economic ties so as to set a precedent for future cooperations. So this will also ensure a lot. Admiral Arun Prakash mentioned about Project Sagar Mala. This is by the Ministry of Shipping, and this is about port-led development and coastal eco zones and coastal eco economic units. This will help in cooperation with the others as well. There is a blue economy roadmap which is driven by the Ministry of Earth Sciences and also by Niti Aayog. There's one vertical in that is security and international engagement, which actually the NSCS heads it, and this is actually this will aim to achieve what is the topic of this theme. Fisheries is another massive field where there is cooperation. There are regional fisheries management organizations, the RFMOs, in which India is a member. There is the Prime Minister's Matsya Sampada Yojana, which is for developing fisheries in our country, and in order to, because deep sea fishing is something that we are still poor at, and this is going to. And finally, I just want to mention also about INCOIS, the Ministry of Earth Sciences. There is RIMES, which is Regional Integrated Multi-Hazard Early Warning System. This is for, and also you have the Tsunami Early Warning System, both of which is run by the INCOIS at Hyderabad, and this is for the entire region, for any weather-related warnings to be put out well in time. Of course, the Coast Guard, the oil pollution SAR, these are topics that you all already know. I will stop here because I was told 12 to 15 minutes by the moderator. So finally, all I would like to say is that this topic, key enablers for India as a regional maritime part to ensure all this that you have listed out, it could easily be key enablers for India as a regional maritime part to ensure Sagar. And Sagar, if you want to achieve Sagar, multilateralism is the way ahead, and Navy and the Coast Guard and the rest of the country in the maritime domain is doing a lot, and there is a lot of scope into the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok, for that very wide, sweeping, illuminating look at regional maritime coordination and cooperation. It's your challenge right now, but all these young people sitting in front of us, it's going to be their challenge and their duty in the years to come. So thank you for a very educative presentation. I'm sure it will raise a lot of questions in the young minds. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Rear Admiral Sudarshan Srikhande. He's one of our most erudite and gifted sailor scholars. He took early retirement in 2016 after a distinguished career in the Navy. He has a unique distinction of having attended war colleges in the erstwhile USSR as well as the USA, earning distinction in both. He commanded 3 ships at sea, including a guided missile destroyer, and he served as our defense attaché in Canberra, Australia. In flag rank, he was ACNS Air Foreign Cooperation, a hot topic today, Chief of Staff, Southern Naval Command, followed by 2 joint appointments and joint organizations. He was in the Integrated Defense Staff and in our Strategic Forces Command. His last appointment in the Navy was as Flag Officer, Doctrine and Concepts. Post-retirement, he has acquired eminence as a speaker, both in India and abroad. He is much in demand everywhere. He's a visiting stroke adjunct faculty and regularly conducts capsules in our staff college and all three war colleges. He participates in Track 1.5 dialogues and contributes regularly to military magazines, including the US Naval Institute proceedings, where you find him frequently figured. So, with that background, over to you, Sudarshan.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very kind introduction. Um, I I would like to thank the commandant, the principal, and the deputy commandant of the Naval Academy for another opportunity to participate in the Dilli seminar. And it's a privilege to be able to speak to the cadets and midshipmen of the Naval Academy. Um, and after such useful discussions across the themes, what could one add which might be useful for the cadets and midshipmen to be key enablers for India as a regional maritime power to ensure stability, security, peaceful coexistence, and development in the IOR, the subject of the closing panel to discuss. In 15 minutes, therefore, let me take the opportunity to dip into some matters already highlighted, uh, but perhaps from a slightly different angle. Let me try and make it a small voyage that sometimes reaches into the past and sometimes tries to imagine some part of the future. Firstly, one of the key enablers, apart from the larger enablers that Admiral Prakash and others have spoken about, for India to become a more meaningful regional maritime power will be her leaders. It will be hundreds and even thousands of individuals, and many of you will be part of that grand enterprise whose task and duty it would be to ensure that India's centrality in the Indian Ocean region and beyond, firstly, to help improve national deterrence, and secondly, to help contribute to India's comprehensive national power, concentrating on the less recognized attribute of what I call comprehensive maritime power. Comprehensive maritime power should concern us as men and women in whites, but equally, it should also concern others. As Ambassador Gokhale brought out yesterday, this spans DIME, that is, diplomatic lines, informational lines, military and economic lines of statecraft. More than anything else, it is DIME leadership at policy levels, at strategic planning levels, and finally at tactical levels, where doorbell and diplomatic telephones have to ring, where intelligence and informational instruments, including in the space and cyber domains, have to be deployed, employed, and interpreted, and where military instruments are readied across a range of possible missions, and where economic power, domestically, regionally, globally, will be the critical enabler for comprehensive maritime power and comprehensive national power to matter more. My second point, such leaders and each one of you present in the academy will be part of this grand scheme, as I've said, are needed at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels of planning and execution as you rise in rank and responsibility through decades ahead. Again, as both the CNS and Mr. Gokhale said yesterday, uh, uh, it is more narrowly that your competence as naval and military professionals that will matter immensely. However, more broadly, the narrower virtues of your competence will fit into the larger intertwinings of the DIE, the diplomatic, informational, and economic lines, to make it a dime. This dime is actually the whole of government approach that Ambassador Gokhale mentioned. As CNS and other speakers have added, this is happening in significant measure, but in results so far, China seems to be ahead uh, in comprehensive maritime power as well as in national power, qualitatively and quantitatively compared to India and even the US by several measures. Is China free of problems and pitfalls? Certainly not. Uh, uh, and no nation perhaps is. My third point is that jointness is a key enabler, and especially at the people/leaders levels. The larger jointness is within the dime itself, and here I would like to call the dime the rope of statecraft, as I have been suggesting for some time. Most of us in the audience are seamen, and we know that the way fibers are spun into yarns, yarns twisted into strands, which are finally twisted and laid into a rope. And as you know, the three attributes of a rope are strength, elasticity, and at the same time flexibility, which means in terms of elasticity, that when subjected to strain, it can come back to its original virtues. Many speakers, including Admiral Ashok Kumar, the NMSC, have explained the issues with dime, and this is so I will not belabor it. But let me say that India, as a growing middle power, an aspiring great power, has to take a leaf out of the histories of great powers, as much to learn the circumstances of their rise as also the causes and the circumstances of their decline. Reaching back into Indian history, the Chola Empire's use of sea power across the dime, if I may put it that way, and the subsequent impact that relatively reduced sea power had in the decline of that otherwise long lasting empire is an area where much scholarly research is going on and much more needs to be done. This is not unusual. The American Alfred Thayer Mahan, the British Julian Corbett, or Paul Kennedy, or the Indian strategist K.M. Panikar all analyzed history to draw out parallels that could apply to the strategic and especially maritime strategic environments and conundrums facing a current generation of leaders, not only naval or even military, but across the dime. May I mention a comment made by Rear Admiral James Goldrick, a friend who retired from the Australian Navy, where he said that the Chinese are reading Mahan to name only one, as much to understand why the French lost while the British won. How about that approach to analyze the past? These 4 years at the Academy have given you an introductory idea, which is much more than what we got as cadets some decades back and lacked perhaps even as young officers. In your decades ahead, in service wearing a uniform, or thereafter, perhaps in calmer and more reflective retirement, do continue the study of history and its linkages with strategy through the works of these few I mentioned and the many others in a much deeper way than has been the general preference globally, which is via shallow reading, myth building, and even misinterpreting and misquoting. It can only be to the good of India that the Indian Navy, and for the combined benefit of our growing numbers of regional and global friends, that a good number of you continue your own professional military education, informally at an individual level, and formally at opportunities that the armed forces will bring to you. Former CNS Admiral Karambir Singh suggested something like this to you yesterday. Do give it more thought. Fourthly, sea power has been the most effective when it is joint and dynamic. Infantry went to sea in the galleys of ancient Persia, Greece, and Rome, as did during the Chola period or during the Basrur expedition of 1665, which Shivaji personally led with embarked infantry. In the 15th century, artillery went to sea, and slowly, ships under sail and with gradually increasing sizes of ships, as well as the caliber and number of guns they carried, started impacting warfare at sea in an immediate sense and on land at a slower pace. The underwater and then the aviation revolutions had obvious major impact and followed a few decades after the transitions from sail to steam and from coal to oil. After the Second World War came the nuclear revolutions that spanned both nuclear deterrence via nuclear weapons maintained in a framework to prevent the very failure of nuclear deterrence and for propulsion of naval vessels, especially submarines. These were covered in detail by your commandant in the forenoon today. In decades ahead, you all will be increasingly parts of the revolution that have now greater dimensions of space and cyber as part of the 5 dimensions of joint warfare. My fifth point, therefore, flows from this. Yesterday, the CNS made a point about dynamically thinking about sea power and strategy. Another extreme important observation was again by Mr. Gokhale, who mentioned that doctrine usually lacks technology. Here, may I suggest to your younger, agile minds that these observations have rung true in the past, ring true today, and might even tomorrow across navies in different measures and at different periods. In a narrower naval or military framework, we should at least reduce, if not prevent, the lag between developing doctrines at strategic, operational, and even tactical levels of warfare. I could give you some examples of the good as well as not so good in the discussions. But the point I would like to stress here is our 3 points on technology. First, that technology is not nor ever has been a substitute for strategy or strategic imagination. However, technology is very important, it matters. Second, that people are involved in doctrine development and you too shall matter. Third, that the way technologies are used to use or foiled by smart leaders, even when similar technologies are available, will matter a great deal, as the past demonstrates only too well. My sixth point again is to suggest that significant changes in what we may call once again the famous enunciation of quote unquote fort and the fleet. Despite the brief time allotted, I might explain this. British Admiral Jackie Fisher ended up inventing a quote he attributed to Nelson that, I quote, a ship's a fool to fight a fort, unquote. Nelson not only never said this, but actually, on a few occasions, used his ships' guns to quite literally fight forts such as at Cadiz and Copenhagen. In the other direction, Shivaji not only built a few coastal forts to fight the Portuguese or other fleets, but fought to take a few forts belonging to the Siddhis, Portuguese, and others. But likewise, he also lost a few forts too. In our own times, understanding these distinctions is to consider everything on, above, or under the sea as the fleet, and all that impacts on under and above the sea that originates on land and is as the fort as we understand. Thus, shore based aviation, whether naval or air force, missiles belonging to whichever service or agency, ISR networks belonging to any services or other organizations, expeditionary bases and formations, etc., are all part of the fort that helps our fleet or hinders that of a foe. Of course, space and cyber dimensions are neither really new dimensions, unlike what is imagined by some, are ones that comprehensively and continuously impact the fleet as well as the fort. Along with this idea are three significant trends that are again not fundamentally new, but in quantitative terms, we are seeing great changes and may see acceleration of these changes in terms of lethality, versatility, range, and accuracy of ordnance. The second is the improving accuracy, spread, persistence, and ubiquity of domain awareness for several countries, either on their own or as part of partnership, with platforms of varying types and with space and cyber dimensions and intelligence agencies. The third is how some nations, more than others, notably China, and with the US trying to catch up, uh, the welding we see of the five dimensions of warfare into coherent concepts of multi domain operations, which your commandant explained in some detail this forenoon. Of course, there will be simultaneous trends to develop countermeasures in these domains and multi domain countermeasures as they always have happened in the past. My seventh and final point to tomorrow's naval leaders is that understanding capabilities and limitations of the instruments at hand, or those on the anvil, or those that you would need to develop almost while you are on watch at whatever level will be a tactical necessity, operational reality, and strategic imperative. Likewise, never discount the possibility that a foe might be as if not more agile at some of these issues, or even all these three levels. A good example is from the Peloponnesian War that some, including the CNS, referred to. Athens, an established, talented, well equipped, and even arrogant sea power, was eventually defeated by a Sparta, which was not thought much of by Athens as essentially a land power not capable of much. And this was the Sparta which developed a navy and their skills at fleet work, defeating the Athenians ultimately at the intersection of the sea and beach front by Spartan general or admiral as he became, Lysander, in the Battle of Agostopotami in 406 BCE. I leave you with a concluding thought that all that has been said over the last 2 days, this will require agility from you all young leaders in knitting together people, ideas, and thinking, and then doing it all over again as contextually required. Your forefathers and my forefathers in the Indian Navy have pulled hard for further understanding of maritime power or sea power, and create a good navy. More is always needed, and for which you will not and must not rest on your oars. You, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, are the key enablers. Very many thanks and Jai Hind.
Thank you, Sudarshan. I'm glad, and as expected, you put the whole topic in a historical frame of reference, and I'm glad you exhorted the cadets and midshipmen to refer to history. What comes to mind immediately is that not very long ago, about 50 years ago, when discussing regional maritime power, India was on the other side of the fence. In fact, India pushed through a resolution in the United Nations called the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace and Tranquility, which virtually forbade extra regional powers from entering the Indian Ocean. So we've come a long way from 1971 till today, where we actually welcome outside powers. We exercise with 20 odd foreign navies. So history has a way of changing with changing things with circumstances. So thank you for that exposition. I now invite Professor Srikant Kondapalli as the next speaker. Again, I know he spoke this morning, and I'm not going to introduce him except to say that he's the dean of School of International Studies and professor in Chinese Studies at JNU today. He's educated in Chinese studies both in India and in China. He's been a visiting professor in many Chinese universities. And what he doesn't know about China, the PLA Navy, and China's aspirations is possibly not worth knowing. So over to you, Professor Kondapalli.
Thank you very much, sir. A very good afternoon to all. Let me also thank the commandant, principal, and the deputy commandant, and ladies and gentlemen.
Professor, may I just interrupt, please? I think somebody's mic is on because we are getting some interruptions or interference. So please ensure that everybody's mics are off. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The 2009 India's maritime doctrine lays down 9 steps for as key enabler for India as a regional maritime power. And let me quickly mention these. Geography, access to the seas, proximity to the international shipping lanes, and transportation of global trade related matters, number one. Number two, the maritime bent of mind of the government and the people and the organs of the state. The third is the size of seafaring population and its enterprise, merchant marine, fishing, offshore commercial activities, naval forces, etc. Fourth, shipbuilding capability and technological ability. The chair had already spoken about the technology related requirements as a key enabler. Number 5 is the number, type, and functional efficiency of major and minor ports. The 6th is the size, age, and condition of the merchant fleet, the percentage of imports and exports, state size and technological advancement of the coastal and deep sea fishing fleets, and finally, of courses. So while I have no expertise on India, let me compare that with with China. As China is one of the major success stories in terms of looking at the key enablers in order to become not just a regional maritime power, but with ambitions to occupy the center stage. That is, they have ambition to become the global power, replacing the United States if it is required. So let me look at some of the comparative pictures between India and China as key enablers. First is the government response. Both in China and India, there has been a neglect of the maritime domain awareness in the beginning, 50s, 60s, 70s probably, and it's only recently after the globalization we have seen much. Although both have a lot of historical maritime expeditions, forays, and conquests throughout the region. So this neglect now is being remedied both in India and China. Um, uh, we have also seen a relative decrease in the ground forces influence as a result of this, both in China more rapidly and gradually in the case of India. For example, I just cite an example: 52% of Indian budget goes to the Indian Army, while Chinese Indian Navy gets about 17% roughly of the capital expenditures. I may be wrong. I pick up one year to indicate this. In the case of China, it is 18% for the army and 24% for the navy. In again in capital expenditure terms. Um, so that is what the Chinese have acquired by pushing the. And one of the white papers released by China suggests to the Navy, Air Force, and the rocket forces as power projection. So that is an indicator where they are putting their money in. In the political life as well, the army relatively dominates in India. We see various army generals becoming members of parliament or even ministers in the current cabinet or in the previous ones. In the case of China, we saw only one, Admiral Liu Huaqing, who became the CMC vice chairman, Central Military Commission vice chairman. So comparatively, but he had introduced the 2040 scenarios and how they could build up a blue water navy by the time. In the case of India, the overall trade is $600 billion, 650 around that, and this year we probably will expand further. In the case of China, it is $4 trillion of trade, imports, exports, and so on. I'm glad we have the Maritime Security Coordinator position. That's an indicator where this government is emphasizing on. The Indian Ocean diplomacy, Prime Minister Modi began with his tenure in 2014 with this aspect. And of course, as other speakers mentioned, the Sagarmala and others. In the case of China, in 2009, they formulated a two ocean strategy. And Xi Jinping, while he said he has no intention to militarize the South China Sea, he did the opposite. 3,200 acres of built up area in South China Sea. So I think there is something that the government response here also need to further enhance the Indian naval capability and of course the maritime domain awareness. Um, Let me compare the India-China in terms of the maritime issues. Um, in the case of India, the coast or oblique area ratio is about 5.8 um, meters per square kilometer. In the case of China, it is 2.2 meters per square kilometer. So we actually have a huge coastal kind of predominance. If you leave these South China Sea areas that China is militarizing. Shipbuilding is, China is, we are 21,000 GT, and the Chinese, in terms of shipbuilding, is 23 million. So there is a huge difference here. Ship recycling is about 5 million in the case of India, but in the case of China, it is not much, about less than a million GT. So here recycling is quite substantial in the case of India. National flag fleet in India is about 17,000 deadweight ton, thousands deadweight ton. But in the case of China, it is 1 lakh thousand DWT. So there is a slight increase in the case of China on the national flag fleet. The other is the fleet with total fleet. In the case of India, 1,700 roughly, and China is almost 5 times the Indian figures. So that is where I think we need to do a lot of improvement. Fleet ownership is about 25,000 thousands DWT in the case of India, but China is 10 times that, 231,000 DWT. Container port throughput is about 16,000 TEUs. In the case of China, it is again very prominent, some 245,000 TEU output throughput. Number of seafarers is almost the same in India and China. 1,13,000 in the case of India, 1,34,000 in the case of China. Number of port calls, there is a huge difference here. 38,000 for the Indian Navy and 2,61,000 for the Chinese Navy. So there is also there that we need to compare and fix this problem of the key enablers here. Another comparison is in terms of ports. China today has 7 of the top 10 ports in the world by container throughput. And India has only 12 major ports, 200 non-major ports. And so there is a lot that we need to do as part of the Sagarmala. Specifically, as trade increases, we need to connect the interior. That is very necessary for us if we have to become a maritime power. So in shipbuilding as well, 96% of global shipping containers are produced in China. We are 21st in shipbuilding. So that is again a figure that we need to, kind of tweak a lot on that. Total traffic handled at the Indian ports is increasing, but when you compare that with the Chinese, there is a huge disparity here. So Sagamala has outlined about 200 plus ports for connectivity projects and improving access to ports via road, rail, coastal, or other inland routes. In the case of China, they are now very well connected, as $10.54 trillion has been spent on infrastructure projects. In addition, China today owns about 100 ports in 63 countries. We have Chabahar, Sabang, and others. I think we need to increase our footprint in this direction. Energy is another enabler in terms of imports and others. In the case of India, we import something like 200 million tons, worth nearly $120 billion. In the case of China, 513 million tons, second largest importer, with a 178 billion budget for this imports. So there is the energy consumption also as a factor in this. But we are, both China and India are away from the production hubs, and so there is the vulnerability. Also with the energy prices increasing, as we just saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, things have created a lot of havoc in the energy prices. Finally, I would compare the navies, which of course there is a huge imbalance here. 70,000 personnel in the Indian Navy, 260,000 personnel in the Chinese Navy, 17 submarines, 28 surface ships, 169 patrol coastal combatants for Indian Navy. The Chinese have 62 submarines, including 6 SSBNs, and 86 surface ships with nearly 36 destroyers of different varieties. But most important, also the frigates, 45 of them, having the largest number. One can debate about the quality of these, but nevertheless, that is. Also, we have seen there is a lot of, in the shipyards, they are churning out the LSTs, landing ship tanks for the amphibious operations. So the ambitions are quite clear in this. So let me stop here by saying that the key enablers, we need to focus on the GDP figures, because that would have a direct impact in terms of fund allocations, infrastructure build-up, or others. Secondly, in terms of maritime capacity buildup, we need to focus on this area substantially, and we need to fix this as a priority area. Domain awareness is also another. We need to bring in the civil society and other components in this aspect. I agree with the chair on the international cooperation with Indian Ocean as the focal area of that cooperation. Finally, I would suggest to the maritime port construction activity, which we, of course, are involved in extensively. And as part of the Quad division of labor, we have taken the port construction as one of our activities. While the US focuses on energy, Japanese focus on high-tech manufacturing, the Australians in terms of distribution. A formula we adopted even for the COVID-19 vaccine distribution and other aspects. So let me conclude by saying that we need to put our act together to increase the various indicators of the key enablers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for bringing out quite starkly the huge contrast between where China is today and where we are today in the maritime domain. There is a huge irony here because, to the best of my knowledge, India has a far longer history of maritime activities and maritime tradition than China. From whatever I've read, China seems to be confined to the Zheng He era of about 30 years, where he undertook 6 voyages before his ships were burned. Whereas our maritime tradition goes much further back, and yet today we've been left far behind. This is a topic that I think we can talk about in the Q&A session. But thank you for your presentation. Our last speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Darshana Barua. Dr. Barua is a fellow in the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she leads the Indian Ocean Initiative. This is in Washington, D.C. She's also currently a visiting fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Tokyo, where she's working on a book about the significance of strategic islands in the Indian Ocean region. Her primary research focuses on maritime security in Asia and the role of the Indian Navy in a new security architecture. Her work also examines the strategic implications of China's infrastructure and connectivity projects, as well as trilateral partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. These are all topics of great interest to us, and I'm sure the cadets and midshipmen will benefit much from our talk. Over to you, Dr. Barua.
Thank you, Admiral Prakash. To my co-panelists, the Academy and the Commandant, and everyone in the room, thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to speak with you today on the Dilli series webinar. There's very little that I can perhaps add after my co-panelists and such eminent speakers have already talked about the topic and what India can do and what the Indian Navy has been doing. I thought perhaps I would come at it as an outsider or an external perspective, as a researcher who looks at the Indian Ocean region and the Indian Navy and place it within the current geopolitical and security environment, and where perhaps where does India stand, or where the Indian Ocean stands in the geopolitical conversations that we see happening across the globe. I'm really thankful to Admiral Shrikhande, Vice Admiral Shrikhande, to talk about, to mention the historical perspective of it, which I think is very necessary and to a certain extent urgent in understanding the geopolitical dynamics as well as the Indian Ocean region as one theater. It's very interesting to understand where the region could go, how different players can play out their own approaches, their own ambitions and intentions in the Indian Ocean region. It's quite interesting to see how different maritime powers throughout history has behaved in the Indian Ocean region or approached the Indian Ocean region, which would very different, not only for India, as Admiral Prakash said, in terms of the way India approached some activities in the 70s was significantly different than how India approaches those very same activities in the current geopolitical in today's environment, and that has a lot to do with geopolitics. In the post-1945 world, of course, the Indian Ocean gained a lot of prominence in geopolitical maneuvering between the 60s and somewhat up until the early 90s and throughout much of the Cold War period, where the United States built its own presence, including Diego Garcia at the Indian Ocean region, and its engagement with and the threats that Washington saw coming from USSR, as well as concerns about a communist China at that point in time. After the 90s, for in the last couple of decades, maritime security or maritime conversations fell through the geopolitical conversations and maneuvering, and Indian Ocean was considered a sea or an ocean of peace and calm without much um, contention or disputes in a way that we started to see in the South China Sea beginning 2012, which became much more prominent. Today in the last couple of years, maritime security has regained that prominence in geopolitical and political conversations in a way that we hadn't perhaps seen in the last 20 to 30 years. And this is again tied to the geopolitics of the day and perhaps the construct of Indo-Pacific as a new geographic definition or the new theater for both competition and cooperation, which brings together the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, providing it as one theater where much of the competition as well as collaboration between different partners will take place. The Indo-Pacific places maritime security at the core of foreign policy engagements, and this is also new for India, where India did not necessarily look at the maritime domain or maritime security as an area of priority unless there was a threat at sea or unless it was of an urgent nature, unlike a lot of other maritime powers across history, who's always placed maritime security at the heart of their national strategy as well as foreign policy engagements. A series of events and developments have brought maritime security back into its prominence, and we've heard a lot about China being a maritime power and its ambitions of being a maritime power, and China's role, activities, and interests have certainly increased this investment or this outlook towards maritime security. In 2000, China's deployments to the Indian Ocean region, beginning with the anti-piracy missions in 2008, but more recently, perhaps with submarine deployments in 2014, as well as the base in Djibouti in 2017, are some of the developments or that points towards a new contention, new competition, and a new actor in the Indian Ocean region. Perhaps before Chinese activities that has taken on a continuous and a frequent presence in the Indian Ocean region, Delhi was comfortable in its collaborations and presence with the United States in whatever form and whatever level it was maintaining its presence, as well as with other partners. And there was an understanding within the Indian Ocean region in terms of division of labor, in terms of who was more prominent in which part of the ocean. But with China's entry into the Indian Ocean region, along with its own maritime ambitions, but perhaps also China's interactions with India on the continental border, and the recent developments have led to a more acute attention that has been drawn into the Indian Ocean region. Combine this with China's initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the Maritime Silk Road developments in Hambantota or Maldives, has brought the conversations on the Indian Ocean region and what maritime security offers in terms of foreign policy engagements, in terms of strategic collaboration and cooperation, has become a conversation of the day in a way that was perhaps not as prominent in the last couple of decades. Coming to a phrase that is most associated with India and the Indian Navy when the region or when external powers talk about India and the Indian Ocean region is the net security provider. Admiral Prakash did point to it and mention it in his opening remarks, and the interest in the United States was the first country who had said that India should be a net security provider, and since the term has essentially been caught on and is how most of India's partners view New Delhi in this role. But one of the fact that surprises most countries, perhaps, or most at least people that I speak with within our research community is the budget for the Indian Navy within the Indian defense within India's defense budget, which goes to show where India's military priorities or threats or capabilities lie. And it is credit to the Navy that despite the resource constraint and the budgetary constraints of the last several decades, and the Navy has been and India has been able to um, position itself and mark its presence as a key security provider and a productive and a good force in the Indian Ocean region. And how India was able to do that, I think, was very well laid out by speakers who've spoken before me, and as well as the National Maritime Security Coordinator on HADR, first responder, building on these initiatives and activities with mission-based deployment, the IFCIR, the coastal radars, and a series of different initiatives. But there is one aspect in the next security provider, if this is something that the Navy aspires or hopes or is serious about, I suppose, in the Indian Ocean region, is what essentially would be the Indian Ocean region. There is a geographical disconnect somewhere in the conversation on maritime security in the Indian Ocean. After the end of the Cold War, the Indian Ocean ended up being divided into continental silos, and this is a bureaucratic issue which is also true for India's Ministry of External Affairs. Most of the Indian Ocean region has been divided between South Asia, Middle East, and Africa, which is how different political branches and government bureaucracy looks at the Indian Ocean region through continental desks. Say somebody sitting in Paris or Canberra, Tokyo, or even Washington would look at Sri Lanka, Maldives, and India as part of the South Asia branch, would look at Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar as Africa, and look at the Persian Gulf as the Middle East or kind of Arabian Sea area, and not look at Indian Ocean region as one theater, as one geography, from the eastern coast of Africa to the western shores of Australia, or however different countries define it differently. And what are the main driving points? What are the choke points? What are the main areas? Looking at Indian Ocean region as one theater to really understand the maritime domain and the maritime activities will be helpful in understanding where the geopolitical conversations and the interactions are going to go moving forward. To provide an example, prior to the Cold War period, during the colonial period, whether it was the French or the British, the Indian Ocean was viewed as one theater. And the country today who's doing that is also essentially China. China is the only country with an embassy with, say, all the islands in the Indian Ocean region, all the way from Sri Lanka to Comoros. There is no other country, not India, not UK, not France, not US, who has an embassy in each of these islands in the Indian Ocean region because of the silo of breaking Indian Ocean region into either continental desks or the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Indian Ocean. And somewhere through the 70s and 80s, also there came an understanding where India is the more prominent power in the Eastern Indian Ocean, and perhaps France is a prominent power in the Western Indian Ocean. Again, to go back with a small example on how the Indian ministry too divides this is, in 2016, the Ministry of External Affairs set up the Indian Ocean region, which is an effort and which is a welcome step to look at Indian Ocean region as one construct, as a maritime view and approach to it. And it included the islands, it included the neighboring states of Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles. But it left on Madagascar and Comoros at that point in time, the only other two islands in the Western Indian Ocean, because of this limitations and imaginary boundaries running through the ocean. And it goes back to a number of issues, including budget, including capacity, including threat perception, and a number of areas. That step was corrected in 2019, and today India does look at the Indian Ocean region division, look at all the islands under one. But I'm not sure that it has essentially been practical. It has been adopted into practice that India look at the Indian Ocean region as one theater at one area. To better understand the developments across the maritime domain. As a next security provider, the question would really be about, is India able to defend its own own interests, own energy lines, as well as provide that security to others. And where the geographic division is, whether it is all the way from Africa to the Straits of Malacca, or is it going to be prioritized into perhaps the northern Indian Ocean or eastern Indian Ocean? Is it going to be also Straits of Malacca to the Straits of Hormuz, or is it going to be somewhere in between? And if it is going to be all the way from Straits of Malacca and say the Mozambique Channel to the Straits of to Strait of Hormuz, then what sort of capacity, capability, coordination, and collaboration is India going to need to really be that naval power and to really be that maritime power it seeks to be, and that the political leadership talks about very often? Um, there is no denying maritime security. The maritime domain is an area of advantage, including in terms of geography. But the question really will come down to about sustaining that prominence, sustaining this presence and power across the Indian Ocean region. Which brings me to my last point in terms of going forward, what we can expect or what this would play out. And this is something that has been touched upon by all of the previous speakers, which is about international cooperation and international collaboration. Um, in oceans are vast. The Indian Ocean is huge, and there are capacity constraints. There are budgetary constraints that India will be faced with, that India has been faced with. But there are ways to mitigate a lot of these challenges that might not have an answer overnight or even in the next decade. And a lot of those answers a lot of those issues can be resolved through partnerships, international collaborations. Vice Admiral Ashok Kumar talked about LIMOA, Logistics Exchange Agreement, which has allowed Indian Navy and India to operate in areas which are far from its own shores. Again, in the Western Indian Ocean, perhaps to La Reunion, where PAs go and deploy at least once a year. And these are some of the ways in which India can leverage its maritime partnerships, leverage its Indo-Pacific partnerships, and use maritime security to both secure and build in its own capacities, build in its own requirements and its interests, as well as provide that security to across the Indian Ocean region. A good At this point in time, given the dynamics within the Indo-Pacific, most of India's partners see India as a key player as well as critical actor in its own maritime security collaborations, in its own Indo-Pacific engagement, and its own Indian Ocean activities. A lot of the nations, however, including the United States and Australia and Japan, have very different perceptions of Indian Ocean, which vary from India itself, because India is actually based in the Indian Ocean region. And that is very natural. For Australia, South Pacific will always feature more. For Japan, the Northeast Asia will always feature more. US is a little bit of everywhere, but their priority will always be the Pacific over the Indian Ocean region. And one of the reasons why, as Admiral Prakash mentioned, why US has been so encouraging or so supportive of India becoming the net security provider is essentially to secure to be able to divide burden share its role and responsibility in the Indian Ocean region and help or provide or let India be the main power and provide security in the Indian Ocean region, where it plays a secondary role or it plays a supportive role to India, so that it can focus more in the Pacific as well as both Western and South Pacific. For India, of course, it will come down to really creating its own maritime strategy, a strategy that is in sync between the Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and the Navy. The Navy is forward thinking. The Navy, I think, for obvious reasons, will be better placed to make a lot of the strategies and to define what is possible, what is not possible, and what India can achieve and what it needs to do to build that capacity. But the system in Delhi and the way it works, that unless the political branch, the political bureaucracy is supporting the same vision, it'll be harder to achieve the goals set out. So I would say a strategy would be the one best place to be able to define what India wants in the Indian Ocean region, looking forward, and how it looks to achieve it. But international partnerships will be one of it. we've talked about Quad, the collaborations between India, Australia, US, and Japan, but also India's own partnerships with France, which is one of the strongest maritime partners in the Indian Ocean region. But really, also its neighbors. And as concluding thought, I would say this: India's relationship with Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, Bangladesh, Thailand, Singapore would really be critical as its maritime neighbors, as other countries sitting in the periphery and around key choke points that could threaten India's own security as well as provide geographical advantages for India to secure its own interest and build its capacities. It'll be very important for India to manage its partnerships with both its bigger Western powers as well as its smaller neighboring islands as well and Southeast Asian countries. But most of all, as India looks to define its own maritime strategy and become the power it seeks to be, it is going to be important to really look at Indian Ocean as one theater and understand how that theater shapes India's own interests. What is that there is no necessarily a disconnect between what's happening in the Western Indian Ocean from the Eastern Indian Ocean. In the end, the first Chinese overseas base did come up in the Indian Ocean region, but it was on the Western Indian Ocean on the coast of Africa. But the moment we say Africa, we think continental Africa, and the maritime aspect somewhere disappears from it. And to break down these silos, I think it will be necessary to understand the Indian Ocean region as one theater, as one space, from Africa all the way to the Straits of Malacca, if not to the western shores of Australia. I'll stop here and look forward to the question and answers and the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Barua, for giving us this view from Washington, D.C., as it were. You are right in pointing out that India has not looked at the Indian Ocean as a cohesive space, and for very good reasons. One was that the colonial powers themselves didn't see Indian Ocean as a geostrategic space. They just saw it as a thoroughfare for trade and commerce, or something connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. So it took some time for us to come to terms with the fact that Indian Ocean is a strategic reality for India and to treat it as such. And therefore, we have external powers urging us to become a great power. Um, this this business of net security provider. This was a term totally alien to us till Robert Gates mentioned it in 2014. And then slowly over the years, it was picked up by us. And then the Indian Navy assumed the role of net security provider till some factors, which I am not aware of, made them drop it. Now, this term is no longer in use. Now we use the term preferred security partner, or a first responder, which is much more realistic, less ambitious, perhaps within our means. So I think nations need to be flexible on these issues. And of course, you're right in pointing out that as a nation, we've been a reluctant sort of power, especially maritime power. But the Navy has kept its own counsel, and it's been always one step ahead. So hopefully things will, as our economic power grows and as our capability, less preoccupation with domestic issues, then we look more outwards. And you're right again in pointing out that the MEA opened a division, not an Indian Ocean division, it's an Indo-Pacific division, which they've opened just very recently. So as time goes by, I think attitudes will change. So thank you for your presentation. So thank you, my fellow panelists, for keeping to time. I think we have enough time in hand for Q&A from the cadets and midshipmen. But before I hand over to them, I got a couple of issues which I want to throw to this panel. One is that, as I just said, as a nation, we've been a reluctant to don the mantle of whether it's regional power or global power or whatever, or maritime power for that matter. But China, with a shorter maritime history, has leaped ahead because the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party, decided at some point of time that the oceans were going to be a great factor in their future, in China's future, for the simple reason that China is the greatest producer of goods. It's the greatest trading nation. Is the biggest trading partner to about 100 countries worldwide. So trade is the lifeblood of China, and the realization dawned on them not too long ago that being a maritime power was essential to China's rise to being a global power or a peer competitor to the USA. So, having decided that China is going to be a great maritime power, they took all the steps that were necessary to achieve this aim, and which was to start a shipbuilding industry and to give it a huge boost, to start a shipping line. They've acquired ports all over the world. They've developed their ports so that there are, out of the best 10 ports in the world, 7 are Chinese. So they've given maritime power the kind of priority that it deserves. In our case, we've also, there is a realization, but it's a sporadic or intermittent realization that maritime power does matter. And that is why the Prime Minister has egged on people to undertake this Sagar initiative, which needs to be fleshed out. There needs to be a implementation plan. There need to be accountability on people. What does Sagar actually mean in concrete terms? Similarly, Sagarmala. Sagarmala is not the first such plan. It started, the Sagarmala 1 started in 2001. This is the second or third such plan. How much success it has achieved, we are not very sure. So my point to the panel is that slogans and cliches and exhortations are very well. Our statesmen, I mean, the Prime Minister can push people, but he can't. He can't make people do things. So, are we on the right track? Are we going to get where we should be getting? Maybe not like China. We're not a totalitarian state. We can't do things that China can. But are we on the right track, and are we going to make progress at the right pace? The other second point I want to put to the panel is that it's okay for us to talk about, regional security, peaceful coexistence, etc. But the Indian Ocean, not just the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific is going to be a contested space. And while we may shy away from saying so, China makes no bones about it. They've already recovered 3 to 4,000 acres of land out of South China Sea, where there were only rocks and shoals. They've dredged it out and created artificial islands. So they've staked claim to this that 9-dash line, etc. They've staked a claim to a territory in the Himalayas, and they are going to make an entry into the Indian Ocean. The only reason they haven't come, I mean, they've sent their submarine so far. The only reason a surface force hasn't come to the Indian Ocean is because they lack an aircraft carrier escort. But sooner than later, they will have an aircraft carrier which they can spare from South China Sea for the Indian Ocean. It may be a squadron, it may be a task force, or it may be permanently based here. So if Indian Ocean is going to be a contested space, then we can seek peaceful coexistence and development and stability. But we need to, think in those terms that we will have to compete with China, even to gain influence in countries that are at our doorsteps. We saw the case of Sri Lanka. One hopes that, I mean, without being sounding, without any sense of Schadenfreude, that Sri Lanka is a lesson to everybody that how you can fall into an economic trap, debt diplomacy. So, with that background, may I request the panelists to give their comments, starting with Vice Admiral Ashok Kumar. Ashok, this is a good opportunity for you to tell us how this Navy's dream of having a maritime security coordinator came true out of the blue. We've been looking for a maritime commission or a maritime body to look after, but I think this is the best solution of all. So if you can give us a few words on this topic. We've got enough time for the cadets and midshipmen. Over to you.
Yes, sir. First, about the National Maritime Security Coordinator, billet. Actually, there were recommendations at various points in time back in history, as you're aware. But I think the concrete step got taken when the Kargil Committee report, which was by Dr. Jaishankar's father, Dr. Subramaniam, who submitted, he had only considered the land border, and that report was submitted to a group of ministers. And the group of ministers, instead of looking at only the recommendation, decided to take a look at the entire security architecture of the nation. And in that, they also covered the maritime domain. And so that time, this was in 2001 that the group of ministers' recommendations came out. There were a number of these recommendations. Like I mentioned in the previous session, that all that is existing now, whether it's the Coastal Surveillance Network or the National AIS chain, creation of the Marine, the Coastal Security Police on the lines of Andamans and Nicobars, which already had since 1956, and so on and so forth. So there were many recommendations. Once such recommendation was to, they commented that because there are too many players in the maritime domain, too many agencies operating in the maritime domain, there is a need for apex level coordination. This was the line there, and therefore we recommend institution of a national maritime advisor. So this was the designation which was given then. Of course, nothing happened for years after that, till the time 2611 happened, and Ajmal Kasab came and I think reminded all of us to pull out that report and read it all over again. And finally things started moving. But even then, while rest of it were all fast tracked, this one kind of remained in the cold storage, and I think the Navy kept taking the case up and down again. Like you rightly pointed out, at one stage it was National Maritime Commissioner, along with a structure, serving vice admiral stroke a retired one, and so this went to and fro. And finally, sir, in 2018, there was a revamping or reorganization of the NSCS, which was done by the present National Security Advisor, and who recommended that we need to get a maritime wing, specifically under the NSA. So that study kind of started all over again, and finally this came into being. In fact, on the 10th of November last year, the Cabinet Committee on Security approved the billet of National Maritime Security Coordinator with a Maritime Security Division under him to be the fifth vertical under the NSA at the NSCS. And on the 16th of February, my appointment was kind of declassified, and I took over as the NMSC. Now, in the structure, it's a multi-agency structure in order to push things. So there is this NMSC. Under him, there are two joint secretaries. One is a serving rear admiral from the Navy. The other one, who's already reported. The other one is supposed to be an IG from the Coast Guard, or an IG from the one of the coastal security police experienced from the coastal state stroke union territory. One, and then there are these 8 deputy secretary stroke directors under them, who are from various ministries, whether it is shipping, ports, whether it is fisheries. There is one from MOPS, Ministry of Earth Sciences. There is one from Navy, one from Coast Guard, one maritime law expert, and so it's a multi-agency structure. And one of the just one more point I want to make on this, sir, is that there was also a multi-agency maritime security group to be created. So that multi-agency group has been created, and it's in 2 verticals. One of them dealing with INT, and the other one with policy. The INT one meets every 15 days to exchange information amongst all the agencies. The agencies, the forces, and all relevant operators in the maritime domain are there for that. And the MAMSG policy, which happens once in 3 months, that's a really good initiative, I think, because that has got not just various ministries and departments and agencies and forces which are in the maritime domain from the center, but also the 9 coastal states of the country and 4 coastal union territories, all of which what then existed as the nodal officer for coastal security has now been redesignated as the state maritime security coordinator, and all those state maritime coordinators actually physically come down here to Delhi to be a part of the maritime security group, multi-agency maritime security group policy meeting, which happens once in 3 months. So that's driving a lot of this agenda, which we keep discussing about. That's very
Thank you. We wish you luck in your assignment. Sudarshan, any comments? Sudarshan?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I will speak a little bit. The other issues that you brought. One is the kind of cohesion and becoming a maritime power. You compared China, and I'll just go back and give an example of the United States in beginning from about the mid 1890s, when they realized the need to become a maritime power in all its spread, as you mentioned, and yet they, by the times of the Second World War, they were certainly a much significant maritime power, and the Second World War itself made them a maritime power, not only in terms of course, having the world's largest navy by far, But in terms of having the world's largest merchant marine itself, uh, before the Second World War, up to 1939, about 40% of the global tonnage was British flag. By the end of Second World War, that percent, although the numbers grew, of course, exponentially because of the war economy, logistics effort that was required, and much of the were actually for war efforts, the Allies, and for the Russians also within that. The United States did become a major maritime power after the Second World War, but the ships under their flag led to two or three things. One is it, of course, led to the shutting down of many shipyards because of overcapacity, a problem that China has also encountered from time to time. The second part was, of course, in terms of crewing itself, that crewing of international shipping declined. American port ownership declined. American shipping ownership declined. British ownership of maritime insurance, remained high, but Chinese insurance is increasing. So there are many of the sort of, to use a term that has been nowadays, non-kinetic efforts in terms of maritime power that China has done exceedingly well on, and in which we are lagging. We have almost no shipbuilding capacity, very steep ownership, very under other flags of convenience or inconvenience we want to use. We also have very little foreign footprint in international maritime insurance financing. We do have a fair amount of footprint in crewing of ships, but which is not necessarily an advantage. It can turn out to be a disadvantage without the other advantages of these levers. So I think there is a lot to be done in that part. In terms of Chinese deployments in the Indian Ocean, my own view is that even if a Chinese aircraft carrier battle group deploys here, we need to shadow it, observe it, and short of conflict, just let them be, under some amount of pressure. Again, in terms of peacetime deployment of carrier battle groups, no earth-shaking outcomes out of neither for the US or throughout the last 15 years, or even the QE2's deployment into the Indo-Pacific. So we should dedication has its value, has its limitations, and like Admiral Ashok Kumar mentioned, there is a trade-off between the kind of training that is required and the reduced training that can come from dispersed deployments. So, which I'm sure uh, are problems for any Navy to solve, including the PLA Navy. So they will
Thank you,
probably deploy in
Sudarshan.
the next few years, few months. Yes.
INA control, can we throw the house open for questions from the cadets and midshipmen, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, the house is now open for questions.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Cadet Suryansh and I am from the 6th term. So my question to you is this. While the prime focus remains on Indian Ocean region, what is the significance of South China Sea, considering it to be the key channel for US and Russia to maintain strategic connections among its naval forces in Asia and Europe? Should India plan to build its string of pearls around South China Sea, considering its strategic importance to China?
Thank you for that question. We'll take two more questions and then we'll get to responses. Thank you. Please sit down. You might like to mention which panelist your question is directed to.
Sir, my question is specifically to Vice Admiral G. Ashok Kumar.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. This is Cadet Nishu Khenchi from 36 NOC Regular. My question is, In recent years, India and Indian Navy have expanded area of interest from Indian Ocean to Indian Ocean region, including West Pacific, and South China Sea. In this scenario, what are the essential elements that the Maritime Theatre Command should have to enable our maritime operations?
Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon, Good afternoon, sir. I'm Cadet Sahil Malik of the fourth term. Sir, my question is, during Indo-China contingency situation, how much help can we expect from Quad countries in present form? Also, should we militarize the Quad?
Thank you. Please sit down. I'll just make a general observation before I invite Vice Admiral Ashok Kumar. We are still a developing nation. We have much to do within our country to uplift our own people. And therefore, defense expenditure is something that we undertake with great reluctance. That's why the government has kept our defense expenditure at the minimum affordable or maximum affordable. Therefore, accordingly, our ambitions should also be tailored accordingly, and we should look after our national interests within our immediate periphery. And the Indian Ocean is at our doorsteps. What happens in the Indian Ocean is of great concern to us. And therefore, the point is that we should look after the security and our interests in the Indian Ocean. For us to reach out to South China Sea or the Western Pacific, etc., is a bit of an overstretch. So just bear that in mind, and I will request Admiral Ashok Kumar to give a more detailed response to this question. The first question, Ashok. The first two, in fact, they're almost the same.
Yes, sir. So the first question is that, navies are expected to go and operate or deploy where our maritime interests lie. So I still recall about a couple of years back, there was a question which was asked, a parliamentary question, to which the answer which was given of our trade through the South China Sea. Interestingly, it was more than 50%. It was about 52% of our trade passed through the South China Sea. So it's a great maritime interest for us. Now, what does the Indian Navy do? There are regular deployments that happen there for specific purposes. Like, for example, you are aware that the Eastern Fleet, I think, has probably left or would be leaving for Malabar, which will happen in Western Pacific in a short while from now. So that, quite like that, I mean, once in 2 years, we've got the RIMPAC, either at Hawaii or at Guam, for which India is a regular participant. We've got our bilateral exercises with all kinds of countries there, whether it is Vietnam, whether it is Indonesia, whether it is now you're aware of whether it is Japan, and so on and so forth. So the number of times that the Indian Navy deploys to that region is pretty considerable. So that, I think, and insofar as you spoke about string of pearls, but in my view, as long as you have an operational turnaround facility with a friend who is present there, I mean, every time our ships go there, we do an OTR either at Singapore or at Philippines or at Brunei or at Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So it's not a problem, and our sustenance has also been enhanced by a number of reciprocal logistic agreements that we have with a number of countries. So that's the long and short of what I want to say about our deployments to the Western Pacific. Next question was on the Maritime Theatre Command and what does it entail. Of course, whenever I'm not sure as to what structure that would take, but one thing was that I was the vice chief when the study was made, and the vice chiefs were made the heads of each of the theatre commands. So I was handling the Maritime Theatre Command, and my recommendation was obviously for the Maritime Theatre Command to have the Western and Eastern Naval Command and the SINCAN at the Far East under the so that it is not like Darshana said, we don't look at it as penny packets in the Indian Ocean and beyond. It should be just seen as one theatre, so that he can manage it, and whether the assets or deployments and so on and so forth, he can kind of call the shots. with the with on both the sub theaters of the Maritime Theatre Command. That's my view.
Thank you, Ashok. The other question was an interesting one about the militarization of Quad. Now, this is an issue that is of concern to us, because should push come to shove with China, then are we in a position to hold our own, or to defy China's designs? And do we need external help? There are two issues here. One is that economics and trade will still trump many issues, and China happens to be the biggest trading partner of all four Quad members. And the other point is that the Quad, other than India, none of the other three have a face-to-face confrontation with China. And how willing will they be to take on a military confrontation with China? So I think any thought of militarization of Quad needs to be treated with circumspection. However, we do need external help, support, partners, allies, etc. And as we just heard from our maritime coordinator, that India has joined the joint maritime structure in the Persian Gulf. What is it called, Ashok?
CMF,
Combined Maritime Force, which we hadn't for all these years. For many years, we were reluctant. So we've done that. So maybe it's a step in the direction of seeking partners and allies, because we will need some kind of external help. But I'll invite Admiral Shri Khande and Ms. Barua to share their thoughts on this topic of militarization of Quad, the possibility for and against. First, Ms. Barua, please.
Thank you, Chair. It is a conversation that has some discussion even in Washington.
Yes.
What should Quad do next? I think Australia, Japan, and US would be very much comfortable in militarizing the Quad, because the three are already in. They are treaty allies of the United States, so they share a certain level of comfort within that. And in Washington says it's a question for India whether India wants to militarize the Quad or not. But from a research point of view, I think there are two things that, and Admiral Prakash, you pointed them out, that will be important to look at it in terms of one is also the regional perception. Right now, the Quad, there is a lot of hesitation toward the Quad, even in friendly neighbors in ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries or South Asian nations, where they say, okay, so Quad is essentially a containment strategy against China. So if you work with the Quad, we are essentially choosing sides, either it's the US side or the Chinese side. But if Quad moves forward in the strategy and the priorities they have outlined currently, which is on non-traditional security issues, still on the maritime side, illegal fishing and vaccines and climate, but it's on issues that are important to the region. And I think that is for the region to get comfortable with a new coalition, a new grouping of people, new grouping of countries, out of which one is not a treaty ally of any of the other three. I think it'll take some working and some comfort level to be able to get there. But like you also said, it's not militarization. If push comes to shove, military hard power is not the only way by sending boots to the ground or in some manner in that way, but also in terms of intelligence sharing, information sharing, maritime domain awareness. I think some of those are happening in different levels, and those can be strengthened, maximized to India's advantage. And I think those are areas that the other three will be willing to do. They are also members of the Five Eyes. I think they have the technology, they have the capacity, and they have the bandwidth to be able to provide the intelligence and information, and then for Delhi to take the decision what kind of an reaction or response it wants to extend. I want to quickly say one more thing on militarization of the Quad. It's often looked at that militarization of the Quad will be in terms of we assess the militarization of the Quad while assessing what India is going to need and if others will come in India's aid. But the conversation was also flipped in the other countries, whereas will India come to any of the others? Will India join the other three should there be a Taiwan crisis? Is India willing to enter into that conversation, or is it going to be a conversation of if others are going to come into the Indian Ocean region to help India in a conflict with China, or is India willing to go into the South China Sea for a military conflict on a Taiwan crisis, because they look at Taiwan crisis as imminent, as something that might be happening, that will be happening. So is India willing to go into something like that to be able to militarize Quad?
Thank you, Ms. Barwa. Thank you. Sudarshan, your views?
I largely agree with what Dr. Mentioning about there are a good example today is provided by Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, and yet many countries of the NATO, not as NATO, but as part of the EU or as in their individual capacities, are assisting Ukraine in various ways. Uh, that can be expected. It is just no coincidence that the Quad members also happen to be part of the Malabar, and in fact, the Quad itself has started from 2004 and gathered steam with a focus. So, therefore, I think whether we need not say that Quad is anti-China, but China keeps saying that for the Quad members anyway. So that's not a problem. The other aspect is that at the strategic and operational levels, the habits of cooperation, I think, have improved vastly ever since the Malabar exercises, and now with all the coincidentally 4 Quad members through the Malabar exercise, but there are other service exercises and multi-domain exercises that are taking place. So I think we are well placed for that kind of cooperation. Even at the if at the tactical levels there are incompatibilities, which is something we can probably live with. It's more important to have strategic cooperation and operational practices that are in sync and in tune, and which are regularly exercised in many ways and in growing complexity. So that's a positive for us.
Thank you, Sudarshan. We can have another round of questions. We've got enough time. Any more questions, gentlemen, ladies?
Good afternoon to the members of the panel. As we know that the commissioning of INS Vikrant has brought about a major shift in our shipbuilding and operational capabilities. And with 76% of the indigenous content, we have come a long way. But what are the other challenges that still remain in our quest for indigenization?
Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. This is Cadet Jaskirat Singh of the 5th term. And my question to you is, sir, though the Atmanirbhar Bharat will be a key enabler in a longer run, do you think the private sector is geared up to deliver as on date?
Thank you. One more question we can take.
Excuse me, sir. The online audience has a few questions to address as well.
I have no access to them, so you can introduce. So after this,
Yes, sir.
so we'll finish this round and then go to the online audience.
Sure, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Midshipman Arjav. My question to you is, given the rising importance of Indo-Pacific, what should be the future strategy of Indian Navy to maintain its status as the preferred security partner in the Indian Ocean region? Sir, can this be elaborated in the policy, platform, and concept dimensions?
Thank you. Please sit down. We'll finish this round and then go to the online. The question about indigenization is a little tricky in the sense that you may hear various figures being quoted at various times, but the fact is that we still have major handicaps in terms of defense industry. If you look at our brand new aircraft carrier, it's a huge, huge achievement. It was designed by our ship designers. It was built in our own shipyard by our own workmen, etc. It's a huge achievement, which we should be rightfully proud of. But the fact remains that the propulsion system is from the US. The aviation gear comes from Russia. The missiles, some of them come from foreign countries. So it's the same with much of what we make, whether it's a Tejas or the Arjun tank or whatever else we make. A lot of the components like engines, guns, missiles, radars, etc., still have a foreign component to it. Now, we can't be 100% self-reliant. No country is like that. Even the USA is not self. But we need to achieve self-reliance in a major portion of what we use in our military hardware, so that when it comes to war, we are not, the tap is not shut off. So there is still a way to go, and I'm sure these campaigns like Make in India, Atmanirbhar will get us there. As far as the private industry is concerned, yes, it is very capable. In fact, we should have allowed private industry to come into military defense production years ago. It has not happened. It's happening now. So I think the future is bright. They will be able to cope. There's much more freedom innovation, ingenuity, which resides in the private sector as compared to the public sector. So the outlook is bright. The last question, I'll invite Ashok. Please take that on about preferred security partner.
Uh, So I think our status as preferred security partner in the IOR region is considerably high. And the fact that we continue to do exclusive economic zone patrols for nations in need, our corpats go on smoothly, and as I mentioned, the mission-based deployments have actually enhanced our ability to be the first responder for anything that happens. You hear of any cyclone, I mean, whether it is, last year and last to last year, if you see cyclones that have hit Bangladesh and Myanmar, or whether they hit Mozambique to the southwest, and even in the past, whether it was Mauritius, a huge flooding that happened in Sri Lanka, all of which within hours, it is the Indian Navy which reaches there. So the biggest advantage that we have is not just the cultural connect, but also a clear understanding on their part that we have nothing to hide. It's a very, very transparent kind of deployments and assistance being provided to them. Why I say transparent is that every EZ patrol that we undertake, whether by the Navy or the Coast Guard, it is always with a joint EZ patrol, with their personnel embarked and with the ships which are deployed, or the aircraft deployed, reporting to their operational centers. So there is a understanding in the region that the intentions are good, and it's a multilateral approach to ensure non-traditional threats don't harm our interests. So this concept of security and growth for all in the region, I think, is well understood by the region, and our status as preferred security partner will not only remain but also tend to get enhanced with time.
Thank you, Ashok. Over to control for questions, please.
The first question on screen. So the first question is by Alex Martin. What steps India should take to connect the Middle East, East Asia, and Africa to become trade king? This will help India to become strong nation in Indian Ocean region.
Over to you, Sudarshan.
Thank you, sir. I think it is not very different from what China has done, or the US has done, or in the past Britain has done. It is firstly to have the manufacturing capacities, the excess capacities to be able to export as well as import goods in exchange from many of these countries. After all, trade is a two-way street, and whereas every country should desire to maintain a higher level of exports to imports, which is a requirement actually to have a current account, profit from quarter to quarter. That's a very important economic fundamental. But nonetheless, to be able to set up certain trade agreements with some of the countries regionally is very important, and it's an ongoing exercise. So I think we are doing quite well. But in terms of access, in terms of tariff protection, in terms of trade barriers, I think all countries have them in one way or the other, to a lesser or greater extent. But we should be also careful, because we should not also disadvantage domestic economy through entirely free trade agreements. So all free trade agreements are less free than expected, and yet on a regional basis, global trade, regional trade does bring prosperity to all. So in that sense, trade is a rising tide that sort of, as they say, the cliche goes, lifts all boats. But it cannot go on increasing indefinitely. Setbacks hurt at the national and regional levels, as has happened during the COVID setbacks globally. So this is something where I think the governments are striving for, and yet there are problem areas.
Thank you. If I may add, there's a new construct called I2U2, India, Israel, UAE, and USA. I don't know the full contours, but I'm sure trade will be one of the issues that this construct can push forward, apart from technology and intelligence and so on. Next question.
Second question on the screen, please. So the second question is by Shruti Menon. How can we align maritime doctrine and strategy with the government's policy and focus on indigenizing technology? Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are. Yes, I've got the question. Yeah. All right. I think, first of all, the government has yet to articulate a national security strategy, or even to articulate national aims and objectives, etc. Informally, we all know where we are going and so on, but formally, like the three services have issued doctrines and strategies, the Indian state has yet to do so. So then alignment will only come. In fact, it should have been the process has been reversed. The government of India should have issued a national security strategy or a security doctrine, and then the three services could have aligned their respective doctrines and strategies. But here, for want of a higher direction, the services decided to issue their own strategies and doctrines. But there is no difficulty in aligning them because they are basically, essentially, we know what the government of India, which way we are heading. Focus on indigenous technology is well known. The government directives are there. The Prime Minister has been endlessly repeating his encouragement about Make in India, Atmanirbhar, etc. So those are quite clear. And so the aims and objectives of the services have to be aligned with the national strategy of Atmanirbharta, and it is happening very well in a rapid manner. And as I think, as the most recent serving officer, I think Vice Admiral Ashok Kumar can tell us a little more about it. And of course, Sudarshan also participates in these issues. So maybe you'd like to comment after this.
I hope I'm not wrong.
Yes, you are audible.
Just 2 points I want to make. One is that a national maritime policy has been drafted. It was done by Niti Aayog and with huge contributions from National Maritime Foundation. Admiral Dilli Chauhan was involved. So that we should expect that pretty soon. And the second point that I want to make is that when it comes to a national maritime security strategy, one of the charters for the NMSE is to produce a national maritime security strategy. So there is light at the end of the answer.
Thank you. Sudarshan, any comments?
Let me only add a small point, and that is that indigenization or Atmanirbharta has always been the Navy's desire actually for decades. If anything, it was sort of the inability to coordinate, to trigger as much as we wanted. That has not happened, like Admiral Prakash himself mentioned. And yet, I think the Navy's efforts have been sustained, or at least the Navy's aspirations have been sustained for decades with indigenous shipbuilding. That the percentage in critical areas of fight and move part are not as adequate is well known. And yet, this is the Indian Navy cannot really develop gas turbines or aero turbines. It has to be a national effort. But whatever was within the Navy's sort of, the Navy has pushed even PSU privaters, gone into public-private partnership, even when the term was never used with the ATV project, for instance. And therefore, I think the Navy has done very, very creditably. Our forefathers have pushed for Atmanirbharta even before the term was being used. And now, I think, as was mentioned by Admiral Ashok Kumar and Admiral Prakash, we need to do the rest of the small bits, get the act together and start working on it.
I agree. The first indigenous warship building project started in 1961 when the Air Force and Army was still importing everything hell for leather. The ATV, the nuclear submarine project, is a classic example of indigenization. It's all top secret, but it's been happening. And lastly, the Navy inaugurated its indigenization, full-fledged Directorate of Indigenization in 2005. That is 17 years ago. Okay, any more questions?
Excuse me, sir. We have another question from one of the officers of the Indian Naval Academy.
Good evening, sir. I am Commodore Mukherjee from the Indian Naval Academy. My question is specifically to Admiral Srikhande. And I'm alluding to the context of key enablers and specifically to strategic thought. And I recall from one of my readings of Ambassador Rajiv Dogra's book on the Durand Line, where he says that the British Empire had a policy that in matters of principles, there can be no compromise. But when it comes to compromise, there may be no principles. And I say this in the terms of a strategic culture which the British had. And as a nation, as we go forward, how do we popularize strategic thought, specifically maritime strategic thought, which will be a key enabler as we go into the future? Thank you, sir.
Sudarshan, did you get that question? You might like to switch off your video. I think your bandwidth
I'm
is a little narrow.
Mukho, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Can you switch off your video and stick to audio?
Yes, I've switched off. I've switched
Yeah.
off. I missed the last part, but certainly what you said about. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Keep going.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes. What Commodore Mukherjee said. Yes. What Commodore Mukherjee said about principles and expediency has been actually a leitmotif of statecraft for across millennia for people, and that's not going to change. And therefore I feel that this matter will continue. And yet, having said that, there have to be values of democracy and social values, liberalism, etc., that do guide us, do guide India, do guide many democracies, which are very important. And I think some part of our statecraft has to be values driven and values based. Even then, there is some flexibility, some bending of a rule here or there that is very much part of statecraft, and this will continue. In terms of furthering the understanding of strategy, it can come through later professional military education, and on the professional military education that we as individual leaders in the armed forces need to keep pursuing throughout our life, and sometimes into retirement too. So therefore, I think the services do a very good job of enabling the facilities for professional military education in quantitative terms, but it is up to individuals within the faculties, within the colleges, and all of us as part-time formal students and informal eternal students, that we continue trying to keep our understanding of strategic issues of sea power sharp enough. And while we remain as sailors passionate about our jobs, we should remain dispassionate in our understanding of history and our analyses that yield then finally the kind of sort of strategic doctrines and documentation which Admiral Prakash and Admiral Ashok Kumar talked about.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the ensuing talk. I'm sure the audience agrees with me that the two-day webinar was one certainly wonderful, enriching ride, culminating.
So, maybe request you for your summing up, sir.
Yes, I don't think there's any need to sum up except to say that the criterion for success of this panel discussion, indeed, the success of this whole seminar would be how much the cadet body and the midshipmen benefited from it. It is for their benefit, the whole show. But going by the quality of the talks that I heard this afternoon, I myself have been educated. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the panelists for their excellent talks, including Dr. Kondapalli, who seems to have left us, and Rear Admiral Srikhande, who's disappeared from the audio or from the video. So thank you, the panelists, thank you, the audience, and thank the Commandant for having invited, on behalf of the panel, for having invited all of us. It was a pleasure being with the Indian Naval Academy. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you for the ensuing talk, sir. I'm sure the audience agrees with me that the two-day webinar was one certainly wonderful, enriching ride, culminating with a befitting finale to the events of the past 2 days. and we are richer in knowledge and exposure for it. I would like to thank the moderator and the panelists for intellectually invigorating sessions and discussions. May I request the quarterly audience to express admiration and appreciation in the customary manner for the contribution to the webinar.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
The moderator and the panelists are requested to log out as per their convenience. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You may resume your seats now. I would like to call upon Rear Admiral Ajay Daniel Theophilus, Deputy Commandant and Chief Instructor, Indian Naval Academy, to deliver the closing address.
Admiral R. Hari Kumar, Chief of the Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Puneet K. Behel, Commandant, Indian Naval Academy, Admiral Arun Prakash and Admiral K.B. Singh, former Chiefs of Naval Staff, our distinguished speakers, moderators, flag officers, both serving and retired, commanding officers, officers, professional cadre officers, midshipmen, and my cadets. The Dilli series seminar is an integral part of the training which we undertake here at the Indian Naval Academy. The seminar was christened as Dilli Series Sea Power under the banner theme of Significance of Sea Power in 2018 to provide adequate exposure to the cadets on the importance of sea power for a nation. 4 broad themes were divided: role of sea power in shaping nations, military use of sea power, maritime history of the Indian Ocean region, and geopolitical impact of sea power. This was done and envisaged to cover all aspects of significance of sea power during the entire 4-year training here at the Naval Academy. This has benefited the cadets that every year they get to witness one of the topics. The Delhi series seminar, over the past 2 days, we have witnessed a range of insightful, thought-provoking, and informative presentations and panel discussions from our distinguished delegates on the theme of the webinar, Geopolitical Impact of Sea Power. We are indeed fortunate to have had Admiral R. Hari Kumar, Chief of the Naval Staff, as chief guest and keynote speaker. With his vast domain experience in maritime strategy and security, regional cooperation, civil-military relations, and jointmanship, he reminded us that maritime challenges have only increased in complexity and scope. Maritime security has now become integral to the concept of national security in our country. He brought out clearly that we need to bring to bear an impactful power from the seas to influence affairs on land. He also said, disregarding sea power saw us losing our freedom. Secure seas is vital for a nation's security and the citizens' well-being. He urged all of you to read the well-articulated book, Ensuring Secure Seas, Indian Maritime Security Strategy. This will clearly help you understand why, how, and what we do at sea. And therefore, I request all the flotilla captains that this book is to be used for the next synopsis during the term break. We are also grateful to Mr. Vijay Gokhale, our invitational speaker and former foreign secretary, who shared his vast experience as a diplomat. He rightly highlighted that the world is in the midst of turmoil. There are serious challenges to the world order. India's Indo-Pacific vision is neither pro-West nor anti-China, he said. It is anchored in India's historical past. We should utilize the geographical location in the littoral states, and we must increase our naval power. He reiterated that India must focus on underwater capabilities and our alliances with IOR regions. As a balancing power in the Indian Ocean, India must have well-developed multi-dimensional naval and military capabilities to protect our sea lanes of communication. Midshipmen and cadets, I would like to tell you, in the last 2 days, we have had 4 sessions, and we were extremely enlightened by the speakers who have spoken to us. The world we are witnessing today is in a huge geopolitical flux. Significant changes are occurring to our east, in the Indo-Pacific, as well as to our west. Many of these could impact the maritime security and interests of India. To overcome these maritime challenges, a few valuable suggestions, recommendations have been reiterated during the course of this webinar, including during the question and answer sessions. I must compliment the midshipmen and the cadets for the very valued questions that they put up. The important ones being the need for India as a maritime nation to channelize adequate resources and put in holistic efforts to attain its aspirations and expectations from the global community to be a reckoning regional power and a preferred security partner in IOR. You as a young cadet today will make the difference for the growth of this country tomorrow. It is for this reason that we have introduced you all to this topic. This must now fester a need to read more on the subject. The speakers also covered to us a variety of different aspects on the geopolitical situations. Many of them spoke on the rise of China, whether it's their military strategy, whether the emergence of PLA Navy, and some also did mention about the militia, their associated problems in our IOR, and what our country is doing. We have extensively been explained the working of Quad, ASEAN, SCO, and the others. And this must quirk an interest in you all to learn more by reading. This will help you as China is and is going to be a problem in the near future. One of the speakers also touched upon how and why we should use gunboat diplomacy and the need for aircraft carriers. We have to project ourselves as a global blue water navy. Gunboat diplomacy is what saw the end to piracy in the Gulf of Aden. And I can tell you this because I was there myself. We also were told that we have 30% of the global poor and that we are energy dependent on many countries and we need to be friendly to them and, more importantly, keep our sea lines of communication always open. But I want to tell you that internally in our country, though the Prime Minister has harped on Swachh Bharat, he has also been saying that we need to conserve the energy which we are using in our country. We need to economize on our energy consumption, and that is dependent on the young population, and which is you. The INA Midshipmen Syndicate has carefully analyzed the historical perspective on relevance of regional cooperation, alliances in ensuring maritime security. The young and dynamic midshipmen from this premier institution did well in presenting their points, and in short, they said that our country must make friends and make them correctly. One point to take back after a lot of discussions that we have seen is that India's role is that of balancing the power in the IOR. But I think the point to take back is whether India's role is that of balancing the power of in the IOR or dictating it. The answer will soon be clear with our growing economic power and the corresponding growing sea power and the growing navy that we have. The speakers thereafter touched upon the Belt and Road Initiative, emergence challenges of non-state actors, technological developments, and implications for India and our Navy in particular. One of them even said that we have to tackle a few neighbors with many hoods. I must tell you that as you all are going to step into the Navy and into the ships, very soon you are going to be faced with non-state actors. And there will be decisions that you have to make even as young officers. You must be prepared for this. I was also tell you that there are certain issues with declining population, declining economy, debts not being repaid. China is creating a problem, and it may not create a problem directly as a country, but would use non-state actors like the militia. We were also covered on very important aspects of the technological developments that are going to be there in the future. One of the biggest technological development that I would see that we have done is because, as you have heard that the kind of technological inputs and growth that's happening is we have ensured that all cadets now get B.Tech degrees. And this is because the next year or next years or decades are going to be network-centric operations, cyber warfare, space domain, and artificial intelligence. And this is what I think we are teaching you all here. And this you must take forward in bigger and leaper ways. The Navy has moved to mission-based deployments. That is, we are operating ships in different regions in the Indian Ocean region. The Indian Navy does see Indian Ocean region as one big area of concern. And therefore, our ships do operate maybe sometimes alone and sometimes in pairs in various parts, whether it's south deployment, whether it's central deployment, whether it's western deployment. I've done a couple of few deployments. And remember, these deployments are very soon going to make young commanding officers take independent decisions. You must start preparing for this. Let me conclude by saying that we are delighted to have a combination of researchers from leading think tanks, experts from academia, former diplomats, retired and serving naval officers to talk to us, moderate sessions, and present papers at this webinar. All the papers presented were of high quality in terms of research and content, and showcased a wide canvas covering the themes of the webinar. They engaged us with their ideas and vast knowledge. Similarly, with their abundant penchant and passion for matters maritime, the moderators who themselves are voracious readers, scholars, researchers, and also the ardent practitioners of naval warfare have exceptionally webbed the sub-themes and conducted each session remarkably well. I am indeed grateful to them, not just on behalf of my cadets, but also of over the 150 officers, our professors, and all the trainees of INA, all of whom I am sure go back wiser today. We hope to see at least some of them, or some of you, again next October in the 10th edition of the Dilli seminar, and we offer our hospitality in person. I know due to strenuous routine here, many of the cadets were unable to pay full attention during the webinar. However, it's imperative to mention that the Dilli series webinar will be available on YouTube, and all of you must take your time out, especially during your turn breaks, to gain knowledge out on the same, as it is very rare to have such eminent speakers to present papers for you. Lastly, as future naval officers, you, the trainees of INA, should spend time to read maritime affairs, geopolitics, write service papers, and present papers at various seminars. Thank you. Jan.
I now request Commodore Abhinav Barve, Registrar, Indian Naval Academy, to render the vote of thanks and mark the culmination of this series of knowledge-driven two-day talks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Commodore Abhinav Barve, the overall coordinator for this year's Dilli series Sea Power webinar. When the overall coordinator addresses the gathering, it is usually a mixture of two emotions. The first is obviously relief that things have largely gone as per the plan. Relief from the chaos, turmoil, and anxiety that were having a field day until now. The second emotion is that of gratitude, because it strikes home with telling clarity how important teamwork, cooperation, and cohesion are in order to make things happen. As William Arthur Ward once said, feeling gratitude and not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it. And I definitely will not be found wanting on that front. So, on behalf of the Indian Naval Academy, let me start by expressing our profound and sincere thanks to the Chief of the Naval Staff for consenting to be the chief guest, as well as the keynote speaker for the webinar. As you rightly said yourself, sir, the only thing more we could have asked for was your physical presence here at the Academy, which would have been the proverbial icing on the cake. I wish to convey our heartfelt appreciation to Mr. Vijay Gokhale for gracing the webinar with his invitational talk, our elite set of moderators for our sessions and the panel discussion, Admiral Arun Prakash, Admiral Karambir Singh, Ambassador Sujan Chenoy, and Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan. Sirs, your presence lent much relevance and stature to this 9th edition of the Dilli series webinar. We are especially indebted to Ambassador Chenoy for his live moderation post-lunch on day one, even though he had returned from a hectic trip abroad only on the morning of the same day. To the brilliant set of speakers, I wish to place on record our deepest gratitude for firstly consenting to be a part of the Dilli webinar, and thereafter adding quality, luster, knowledge, and charisma to the event with your brilliant expositions. I hope you will all forgive our team for haunting you with our continuous emails. This brings me to the esteemed panelists who lit up the virtual stage during the just concluded panel discussion. This audience could not have asked for a more comprehensive discussion on the subject, given that we were being treated to a treasure trove of knowledge by a former Chief of Naval Staff, the current National Maritime Security Coordinator, the Dean of the School of International Studies at JNU, a universally acclaimed speaker on matters maritime and teacher of maritime strategy at the Takshashila Institution and the Naval War College, and a precocious fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Here, we would particularly like to thank Ms. Darshana Barua for netting in live with us from the US in spite of the unearthly time zone difference. May I request this audience to give a generous round of applause for all our speakers, moderators, and panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We would now like to place on record the support, cooperation, and timely clearances accorded to us by multiple directorates at the Naval Headquarters. The Office of the Chief of the Naval Staff, Directorate of Naval Training, and Directorate of Information Warfare deserve special mention. We are grateful to the Media, Publicity, and Information Cell for facilitating the live feed of the event over the official YouTube and Facebook pages of the Navy, as well as ensuring our event got the requisite build-up on social media. Identical sentiments go out to the Headquarters Southern Command for according critical and time-bound approvals and clearances throughout the past few months. A big shout-out goes out to my alma mater, Naval Institute of Educational Training Technology, or the NIETT in Kochi, for making available a force multiplier piece of equipment at such a short notice. Closer home, it was heartwarming to experience the guidance, meticulous eye for detail, and personal involvement of the Commandant, the Principal, and the Deputy Commandant of the INA, all the while according our webinar team creative freedom and leeway to plan and execute. And also because they let me grade cache their officers at any time. The training and admin wings deserve special mention for their contributions, and I would like to single out the civilian IT staff, the staff from the photo section, and the Kautilya Auditorium staff for their unconditional support when it was most needed. I also extend our appreciation to the audience, both in the auditorium as well as online, for your constant enthusiasm and encouragement over the last 2 days. Your participation, involvement, and the quality and intensity of the Q&A sessions were a significant factor in the webinar's success.
Now a word about my team, the real unsung heroes of this webinar. It has been my privilege and good fortune to have such an amazing set of young, motivated, driven, persevering, and most importantly, happy officers who performed way beyond their collective experience, which by the way is in single digits, to produce a high quality webinar. Now, lest you all feel I heap praise upon them lightly, consider this. Every aspect of planning, conceptualization, coordination, administration, design, IT-related expertise, and every single template you saw over social media or on your screens over the past 2 days was made in-house. The streaming software was masterfully handled to take on sessions with sometimes as many as 9 simultaneous guests. Ensuring the smooth conduct of the webinar was not an easy ride, and let me assure you, in a place as remote in terms of connectivity as the INA, it is not meant for the faint of heart. I would like to thank my team for leaving no stone unturned to provide a quality interface befitting the class of speakers at the webinar. And finally, and this one has both emotions, relief and gratitude, for keeping the often elusive and slippery trio called Fortune, Murphy, and the god of technology and internet. I think it is Hephaestus as per the Greeks. So for keeping this trio largely on our side to enable us to pull this one off. I sign off with a sense of satisfaction and hope that the Dilli series event only grows from strength to strength. Thank you. Jai Hind. Sharnavarna.